They cut her hair in broad daylight, and by nightfall, the wind remembered everything. Before we go any further, tell me, where are you watching from? Somewhere quiet, I hope, because this story doesn't speak loud. It settles in your bones. Red Hollow was the kind of town that baked under a hard sun, the kind that measured justice by who held the loudest voice, not the truest one. Dust hung in the air like it belonged there, clinging to boots, to wood, to the silence between people who knew better but said nothing. Ayanna Takota stood in the center of it all, not trembling, not begging, just standing, her dark eyes steady as if she had already seen the ending no one else could. They had dragged her there with words, not ropes, words sharper than anything they carried, calling her a warning, a lesson, something to be made an example of. No one asked what she had done. Out here, her being Apache was enough. Caleb Whitmore watched from the shade of the saloon porch, 10 feet away, close enough to hear the scrape of boots on wood, close enough to see the way the light caught in her hair before it fell. He didn't move, didn't reach for the Colt resting heavy at his hip. Men like him had learned a long time ago that stepping in at the wrong moment didn't change the story, it just added another body to it. Still, something in the air felt off, like the moment before a storm rolls over dry land, when even the wind holds its breath. Ayanna didn't resist. That was what unsettled him most. No anger, no fear, just stillness. When it was over, when the last strand drifted down and the crowd began to breathe again, thinking it was done, she bent slowly, picked up a single piece, and tied it to the rough edge of a wooden post. No one understood it. Not the sheriff. Not the men who had laughed too quickly. Not the women who turned away just in time to pretend they hadn't watched. But Caleb saw it. A small thing. Almost nothing. And yet it carried weight, like a mark carved into something older than the town itself. The wind picked up just then, soft at first, lifting dust, brushing past the buildings like a whisper trying to remember how to speak. Ayanna let the rest of her hair fall where it lay and stepped away without a word, walking past the crowd as if they were already gone. No one stopped her. Not because they chose not to, but because something in that moment made it feel like they couldn't. Caleb stayed where he was, watching the way the string of hair trembled against the post, the way the wind didn't quite let go of it. He had spent years out here, long enough to know when something small wasn't small at all, long enough to understand that some actions didn't echo right away, they waited. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the street, swallowing the place where it had happened. One by one, doors closed. Voices dropped. Even the horses shifted in their stalls, restless without knowing why. And as the last light slipped behind the ridge, the wind changed direction, carrying with it something heavier than dust, something that hadn't been there before. The wind did not rise all at once. It slipped in, quiet as breath across the back of a man's neck, carrying a dry whisper that made the wooden signs creak though no one was touching them. And Caleb Whitmore noticed it first in the smallest things, the way a loose nail tapped against a board, the way a lantern flame leaned sideways without reason, the way every horse in the stable turned its head toward the same direction at the exact same moment, as if something far beyond the edge of town had just spoken and only they could hear it. And inside the saloon the usual noise felt forced, laughter coming too quick and dying too fast, glasses set down harder than needed, boots shifting like men were trying to find ground that suddenly did not feel steady. And Sheriff Douglas Hale sat near the window with his hat low, pretending not to notice how the air had changed, but his fingers tapped the table in a rhythm that betrayed him, slow at first, then faster, like he was counting something he could not see. And outside, the street stretched empty longer than it should have for that hour, doors closing earlier, curtains pulled just a little tighter, because something had followed the girl when she walked out, something no one wanted to name, and Caleb stepped off the porch, boots hitting the dirt, with a dull sound that seemed louder than it should have, and he looked toward the wooden post where the strand still hung, moving not with the wind, but against it, like it had its own direction, its own memory. And that was when he understood it was not a signal sent in anger. It was a message delivered in patience, and patience out here was more dangerous than any gun, because it meant someone was already certain of the ending. And down the street, an old man hurried past without looking up, muttering to himself about whether that did not belong to the sky. And a woman pulled her child inside so quickly the door slammed before the boy could ask why. and the wind carried a faint sound then, so soft it could have been nothing, could have been imagination, except it came again, slightly clearer, not words, not voices, but something shaped like both, something that made the back of Caleb's neck tighten, because it was not coming from one place, it was coming from everywhere at once. Like the land itself had decided to speak, and the horses began to shift harder now, hooves scraping wood, breath heavy, eyes wide, and one of them let out a low sound that rolled through the quiet street, like a warning no man could translate. And Caleb stopped in the middle of the road, turning slowly, measuring distance without knowing what he was measuring for, and he saw the sheriff step out at last, drawn by the same unease, their eyes meeting for a brief second, and in that glance there was no authority, no law, just two men realizing that whatever had been done in daylight had not ended there. It had only begun, and somewhere beyond the ridge, beyond the last line of dust and dry grass, something was moving without being seen, not rushing, not hiding, simply arriving at its own pace, and the wind carried it closer, inch by inch, until even the silence between heartbeats felt crowded. And Caleb knew then that night was not bringing darkness. It was bringing an answer, and not. A single soul in Red Hollow was ready to hear it. The first cry did not sound like a cry at all. It came thin and distant, stretched across miles of open land, the kind of sound a man could mistake for wind slipping through canyon stone. But Caleb Whitmore did not mistake it, because it did not fade the way wind should. It held, it lingered, and then it was answered by another, from a different direction, and then another, until the night itself seemed to breathe with it, low and steady, rising just enough to make every man in Red Hollow stop whatever he was doing without knowing why. And the sheriff turned slowly in the center of the street, his boots planted but his eyes searching the dark edges of the town as if he could force something to appear just by looking hard enough. But nothing moved, nothing stepped forward. There were no riders, no shadows crossing the ridge, no dust trails, just that sound building piece by piece like something assembling itself out of air. And the lanterns hanging along the boardwalk began to sway even though the wind had gone still, their light shifting across faces that had lost all trace of certainty, and inside those faces lived a question no one wanted to speak. Not what is coming, but who did we wrong? And Caleb felt it settle in his chest, heavy and quiet, because he knew the answer had already been given hours ago under the sun, and now it was simply being returned, not in anger, not in haste, but in something far more deliberate. And he stepped forward again, closer to the center of the street where the sound seemed thickest, as if the air itself had weight, and he noticed the strand still tied to the post, no longer trembling, no longer moving at all, like its purpose had already been fulfilled. And a man near the saloon dropped his glass without realizing it, the dull crack against the wood echoing louder than it should have, and no one turned to look, because their attention was fixed on the edges of nothing, waiting for shapes that refused to show themselves. And then the cries rose again, clearer now, layered, not chaotic but organized, spaced like signals passed from one unseen point to another, circling the town without ever entering it. And the realization spread slowly, like cold water through cloth. This was not an attack. This was a boundary, and Sheriff Hale felt it too, because his shoulders stiffened and his hand hovered near his belt without ever committing. Not out of restraint, but because instinct told him there was nothing to draw against, nothing to aim at. And for the first time since he had pinned that badge to his chest, he looked smaller than the man standing beside him. And Caleb watched him carefully, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a quiet understanding that some moments do not ask for action. They ask for recognition, and the cry shifted again, tightening, closing in without moving closer, until it felt like the entire town sat inside a circle it could not see. And the silence between each call grew sharper, more precise, as if something was counting, measuring, deciding. And then it happened, not a shout, not a charge, but a single voice cutting through the rest, deeper, steadier, carrying a weight that silenced everything that came before it. And even though Caleb did not understand the words, he understood the meaning, because every man there felt it at the same time. This was not a warning, it was a question, and the answer had already been written in daylight, waiting now in the dark for someone brave enough to face it. No one answered the voice, not at first, Because the kind of question that settles into a man's chest does not ask for words. It asks for truth. And truth is heavier than most men are willing to carry in the open. So the town stood there in that tight, unmoving silence. Each person hoping someone else would speak first, hoping someone else would take the weight. But the sound in the air did not fade. It held steady, patient, like it had all the time in the world, and Caleb Whitmore could feel it pressing against the edges of every thought, not demanding, not threatening, just waiting. And that waiting was worse than any shout, because it meant whoever stood beyond the dark already knew what had happened, already knew who had done what, and was giving them the chance to see it for themselves. And Sheriff Douglas Hale shifted his stance again, his boots grinding into the dirt as if he could anchor himself against something unseen, his hand finally dropping away from his belt because even he understood now that this was not a moment for drawing lines in sand. This was a moment for facing the ones already drawn. And a man near the edge of the street cleared his throat, the sound too loud in the stillness. But no words followed, only the dry swallow of someone who had found courage too late. And Caleb's eyes moved slowly across the faces around him, seeing the same thing repeated again and again, the memory of daylight returning to them. The moment they had stood and watched and chosen not to interfere, not because they could not, but because it was easier not to. And now that choice had come back, not with force, but with presence, surrounding them without ever stepping forward. And the voice came again, not louder, not sharper, just closer, as if it had taken a step no one could see. And this time the meaning settled deeper, clearer, not a demand for explanation, but a recognition already formed. And Caleb felt something shift inside him, slow and certain, the kind of shift a man does not notice until it is already done. Because he understood then that silence was no longer neutral, it was a decision, the same decision that had been made under the sun. And if he stood there again, if he chose it again, then he was no different from the ones who had acted, only quieter about it. And he took a single step forward into the center of the street, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to break the line that had held everyone in place. And the movement drew eyes, not because it was bold, but because it was first. And he did not reach for his gun, did not raise his voice, he simply stood there and let the weight of the moment settle fully onto him. And for a brief second the air seemed to shift, as if whatever listened from beyond the dark had taken notice. And Sheriff Hale looked at him with something that was not authority, not command, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when a man realizes he may not be the one meant to answer. And Caleb did not look back at him, his gaze fixed on the open space beyond the last building, where nothing could be seen and yet everything could be felt. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, not reaching outward but settling into the space between all of them. He said she did nothing wrong. And the words did not echo, did not carry far, but they landed, heavy and undeniable, because they were not spoken to convince anyone. They were spoken because they were true. And for a moment nothing happened, the town holding its breath, the night holding its place. And then the wind moved again, softer this time, passing through the street like a hand brushing across something finished. And the cries did not rise again immediately. They paused, as if considering, as if weighing what had just been offered. And Caleb remained where he stood, knowing that whatever came next would not be decided by force, but by whether that truth had come too late or just in time. The wind did not answer right away, and that silence stretched longer than any man in Red Hollow was comfortable with. Because silence after truth is not empty, it is listening, and every person standing in that street felt it. The way the air leaned in just slightly, as if the land itself was deciding whether what had been spoken carried enough weight to matter. And Caleb Whitmore did not move, did not look away, because once a man steps into a moment like that, there is no stepping back out of it. And Sheriff Douglas Hale shifted again, slower now, like the ground beneath him had changed without warning, his eyes moving from Caleb to the dark edge of town and back again, searching for something he could hold on to, something familiar, but finding nothing that belonged to the rules he had trusted all his life. And a murmur passed through the people behind them, low and uncertain, not disagreement, not support, just the sound of a town realizing it had been seen, truly seen, and that there was no hiding inside numbers or noise anymore. And then the voice came again, not louder, not closer, but clearer, shaped now in a way that did not need translation, because meaning does not always require language when it carries enough truth, and Caleb felt it settle into his chest like a steady weight, not pressing, not forcing, just there, and he understood that the question had changed. It was no longer what was done. It was what will you stand by now, and that was when something unexpected happened, not from the dark, not from beyond the ridge, but from within the town itself. A woman stepped forward from the boardwalk, slow, hesitant, her hands clenched tight at her sides as if she had been holding something in all day and could not hold it any longer, and her voice shook when she spoke, not from fear of what waited outside, but from the weight of what had already happened inside. She said it was wrong, and the words were small, almost lost in the open space, but they landed because they were real. And another voice followed, a man this time, quieter but steady, saying we should not have let it happen, and the shift was subtle, not dramatic, but undeniable, like the first drop of rain after a long dry season, and Caleb did not turn to look at them, because this was not about him anymore. It never was. It was about whether the town could face itself without being forced to, and Sheriff Hale's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in something closer to realization. The kind that comes when a man sees the line he crossed without ever naming it. And for a long second he stood there, caught between the badge on his chest and the truth settling around him. And then, slowly, he removed his hat, not as a gesture to the people behind him, not even to Caleb, but toward the open dark where the voice had come from. And that movement carried more weight than anything said so far, because it was not commanded, it was chosen, and the wind moved again, softer than before, brushing through the street, like something acknowledging what it had witnessed. And the cries did not return in force. They did not rise to surround or press closer. Instead they faded, one by one, not retreating, but easing, like a presence stepping back after being answered, and the tension that had held the town in place began to loosen, not all at once, but enough for breath to return, enough for shoulders to lower, and Caleb remained where he stood, knowing this was not an ending, not in the way most men understand it, because nothing had been taken, nothing had been broken, but something had shifted, something that would not settle back the way it was before, and as the last trace of that distant sound dissolved into the night, he looked once more at the empty road, beyond the buildings, and for the first time since the sun had stood high above them, the air felt honest again, not lighter, but clearer, like a debt had been acknowledged even if it was not yet fully paid. The night did not end when the cries faded, it settled, and that was worse, because a town can brace against noise, but it does not know what to do with quiet that has already judged it, and Red Hollow stood there under a sky that looked the same as it had every other night, but felt nothing like it, the air thinner, the space between buildings wider, like something invisible had passed through and taken measure of everything it found. And Caleb Whitmore remained in the street long after most had stepped back, long after doors had opened just enough for people to slip inside and close themselves away from what they could not explain, and he watched Sheriff Douglas Hale carefully, not for what the man would say, but for what he would choose to carry forward, because men like Hale did not change in words, they changed in what they allowed to stand unchallenged the next morning, and the sheriff placed his hat back on his head slowly. Not with the same certainty he had worn it earlier, but with a weight that sat differently now, and he looked toward the post where the strand had been tied, but it was no longer there, not broken, not fallen, simply gone, as if the wind had taken the last piece it needed and left nothing behind, and that absence said more than anything that had happened so far, because it meant the message had been received, and somewhere beyond the ridge, whatever had gathered did not need to remain. And a few lanterns flickered out one by one along the street, not from lack of oil, but because no one remembered to tend them, and the darkness that followed was not heavy. It was clean, like something that had cleared the air without asking permission, and Caleb turned at last, his boots slow against the dirt, and he began to walk toward the edge of town, not because he expected to see anyone there, but because something in him needed to stand where the unseen had stood. Needed to feel the distance between what had been done and what had answered it. And when he reached the last building, he stopped, looking out over the open land where the night stretched wide and empty. And for a long moment there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the quiet that comes after something has been set right enough to rest. And then, faint and almost gone. A single note carried across the air, not a cry, not a call, but something softer, something closer to acknowledgement. And Caleb lowered his gaze slightly, not in submission, not in fear, but in respect for something that had chosen restraint when it could have chosen more. And behind him the town remained still, holding on to what had been revealed, unsure yet what to do with it. And he knew that by morning the dust would rise again, voices would return, routines would try to cover what had happened, but something would not fit the same way anymore. Something would stay unsettled, and that was where real change began, not in noise, not in force, but in the quiet discomfort of knowing better. And as the last trace of that distant presence faded completely into the night, Caleb turned back toward Red Hollow, aware that whatever had come had not been there to take anything. It had come to leave something behind, and that something would not be as easy to ignore as a strand of hair carried off by the wind. Morning did not arrive gently. It broke across Red Hollow in a pale, unforgiving light that showed everything exactly as it was, not how anyone wished it to be. And the town woke slower than usual, doors opening with hesitation, boots stepping onto the street like men were testing ground they no longer trusted. And Caleb Whitmore was already there, standing near the center where it had all unfolded, watching how people avoided that spot without meaning to, how their eyes slid past it as if looking directly would force them to remember too clearly. And Sheriff Douglas Hale stepped out of his office with his hat set lower than before, his movements measured, not out of authority, but out of awareness, the kind a man carries when he knows he has been seen and cannot unsee himself. And no one spoke of the night, not at first, because some things do not need words when they have already settled into the bones of a place. But the silence felt different now, not empty, not careless, but deliberate, like each person was choosing it instead of hiding behind it. And Caleb noticed the smallest changes, the way a man tipped his hat to someone he would have ignored the day before, the way a woman paused before speaking instead of filling space with easy judgment, the way even the horses stood calmer, as if whatever had circled the town had taken something restless with it when it left. And then, just as the sun climbed higher, a figure appeared at the far edge of the road, not coming from the hills, not emerging from shadow, but simply walking in, steady and unhurried, as if distance had never mattered. And Ayanna Takota stepped into the light, her head uncovered, her posture the same as it had been the day before, straight, grounded, untouched by what had been meant to diminish her. And the town noticed all at once, not with noise, but with a shift in attention that moved like a ripple through the street. And Caleb turned slightly, not to face her fully, but enough to see her approach without making it a spectacle, because something in him understood this moment did not belong to anyone but her. And she walked past the same post where the strand had been tied, pausing just long enough to glance at it, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging what had already passed. And then she continued forward until she stood a few feet from Sheriff Hale, not close enough to challenge, not distant enough to avoid, simply present. And the sheriff held her gaze for a long second, longer than any man in that position would have allowed before. And in that moment there was no crowd, no law, no weight of the town behind him, just a man and the truth he had to decide whether to carry or set aside. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had ever been, not weakened, but stripped of everything unnecessary. He said what happened should not have happened, and that words did not fix anything, did not erase the day before, but they settled into the space between them like the first stone laid in something that might one day hold. And Ayanna did not nod, did not accept, did not reject. She simply listened, her eyes steady, measuring not the words, but the man behind them. And then, without speaking, she reached into her hand and placed something on the edge of the wooden post, a small piece of leather tied with a single bead, simple, worn, and yet carrying a weight no one needed explained. And she stepped back, not turning away immediately, but giving the town a moment to see it, to understand that what had been taken had not been replaced, it had been marked. And Caleb felt it then, the quiet completion of something that had begun in dust and carried through wind and silence, not an ending, but a line drawn where none had been before. And as Ayanna turned and walked on, leaving the bead behind without looking back, the town did not stop her, did not speak, did not pretend it had not changed, because something had already settled deeper than words, and it would not be leaving with the morning sun. No one touched the bead for a long time, not because they were told not to, but because something about it made it clear that it was not meant to be handled lightly, and it sat there on the edge of the post, small against the wide morning, catching just enough sunlight to draw the eye without asking for it. And Caleb Whitmore noticed how people adjusted their path as they passed, just a few inches wider, just enough to avoid brushing against it, as if the space around it had become something to respect, not fear. And Sheriff Douglas Hale remained standing where Ayanna had left him, his gaze fixed on that single piece of leather and bead, not studying it, but understanding what it represented, because some things do not need explanation when they arrive at the right moment. And the town began to move again, slowly at first, like a body remembering how to walk after standing too long, voices returning in low tones, not the sharp edges of before, but something more careful, more aware of how easily words can become actions that do not fade. And a man approached the post as if drawn by something he could not name, stopping a few feet away, hat in his hands, his eyes not on the bead but on the wood beneath it, and after a long second he reached out, not to take it, but to steady the post where it leaned slightly from years of use, pressing it firm into the ground before stepping back again. And that small act carried further than any speech, because it showed a change not in what he said, but in what he chose to do. And Caleb saw it, the way one action shifted another, the way the space around that bead became something shared rather than ignored. And by midday the town had settled into a rhythm that felt quieter but stronger, like something had been removed that had never belonged in the first place. And Sheriff Hale finally moved, stepping toward the post with a pace that held no urgency, only intent, and he stopped in front of it, close enough now that the bead rested just below his line of sight, and he did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he removed his hat again, not as a gesture to anyone watching, but as a recognition of what stood before him. And when he did lift his hand, it was slow, deliberate, careful not to disturb more than necessary, and he untied the leather from the post, holding it in his palm as if it carried weight beyond its size. And for a moment he simply stood there, the bead resting against his skin, the entire town quieting without being told. And then he turned, not toward his office, not toward the saloon, but toward the edge of the road where Ayanna had walked earlier, and he stepped forward, one pace, then another, leaving the center of the town behind him. And Caleb watched him go, not following, not interfering, just observing the way a man chose to move when no one forced him to. And the sheriff reached the end of the street where the dust began to stretch into open land, and he paused there, looking out into the distance for a long moment, as if measuring how far something needed to travel before it could be returned. And then he bent down, pressing the leather and bead gently into the earth beside the road, not hidden, not displayed, simply placed where it belonged, between the town and everything beyond it. And when he straightened again, there was no announcement, no explanation, just a quiet understanding that something had been given back, not to erase what had happened, but to acknowledge it fully. And Caleb felt it settle then, deeper than before, not in the air this time, but in the people, in the way they stood, in the way they watched without turning away. And as the sheriff walked back toward the town, slower now but steadier, the space he had crossed did not feel the same as it had an hour ago, because it carried something new, something that could not be seen but would not be forgotten. And the bead remained where he had placed it, still, grounded, no longer a message waiting to be heard, but a mark left behind to remind anyone who passed that some lines, once crossed, do not disappear, they become part of the road itself. By late afternoon the town had found its voice again, but it was not the same voice it had carried before. It moved slower, chose its words with care, and Caleb Whitmore could hear the difference in every exchange, in the way men paused before speaking, in the way silence was no longer something to fill, but something to respect. And he stood near the edge of Red Hollow where the road stretched outward, his eyes resting on the place where Sheriff Douglas Hale had set the bead into the ground. And it remained there, simple and unmoving. Yet no one stepped over it without noticing. No one crossed that line without feeling something shift beneath their feet. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the dry earth, Caleb turned his gaze toward the horizon where Ayanna had disappeared earlier, And for a moment, he thought he saw movement far out where the land met the fading light. Not figures, not shapes, just the sense of presence that had come and gone without ever needing to be seen. And it did not return, it did not call, because it did not need to. What it had come for had already been done, and behind him the town carried on, but not the same, not untouched, and Sheriff Hale stepped out once more, this time without hesitation, his posture different now, not heavier, but steadier, as if something inside him had settled into place, and he walked past Caleb without speaking, stopping only briefly near the line in the road where the bead rested, his eyes lowering for just a second, not in regret, not in pride, but in acknowledgement. And then he continued on, back toward the center of the town where his presence would now mean something different than it had before, and Caleb watched him go, understanding that some men do not become better in a single moment, but they begin there, and that beginning is enough. And as the light faded further, the air cooled, carrying none of the tension from the night before, only a quiet that felt earned, not imposed, and Caleb took a slow breath, the kind that fills the chest without resistance. And he knew then that nothing dramatic would follow, no grand ending, no final declaration, because the kind of justice that had passed through this place did not leave behind spectacle. It left behind change, and change does not shout, it settles, and it stays. And he turned at last, walking away from the road and back through the town, not as a witness anymore, but as someone who had chosen his place within it. And as he passed the center where it had all begun, he did not stop, did not look for what had been lost or what had been given back, because he understood that it was no longer in the dust or the wood or the wind. It was in the people, in the way they would choose differently when the next moment came. And somewhere far beyond the reach of the town, beyond the last ridge and the last line of sight, the land remained quiet, holding no anger, no echo, only the calm that comes when something has been seen clearly and answered without force. And as the first stars began to appear above Red Hollow, faint but steady, Caleb Whitmore walked on without looking back, because out here, justice did not need to be chased, and it did not need to be claimed. It only needed one man willing to stand still long enough to let it arrive.